Our talk tonight by Walker Chief Curator Darsie Alexander emerged from, and I'm quoting her here directly, a desire to create a forum to talk about our work as curators, our views of contemporary art, and our practices as an institution. Being transparent to audiences about the curatorial process is something Darsie is no stranger to, as proven by the exhibition she co-organized with the public, 50/50 Audiences and Experts Curate the Paper Collection, currently on view in the Perlman Gallery. Featuring some 200 works hung salon style, 50/50 is at once an experiment in crowd curation and an exploration of the Walker's collection, with half of the gallery containing works voted on by the public in an online survey and gallery kiosk, the other half including chosen works by the expert, or Darsie. So a few quick biographical notes. In November 2008, Darsie Alexander was appointed the position of Chief Curator at the Walker Art Center, where she supervises the curatorial program for visual arts, performing arts, film, video, design, and the Minneapolis Sculpture Garden. Before assuming this new post, she served as the department head and senior curator at the Baltimore Museum of Art, where she worked for 7 years producing exhibitions, overseeing the contemporary collections, and inaugurating the Front Room series. Since arriving at the Walker, Darsie has organized numerous exhibitions, most recently and currently on view, the spectacular Vernacular upstairs, Event Horizon in 2009, also on view upstairs, and Benches and Binoculars in 2009. Other important projects predating her time at the Walker include Franz West, To Build a House, You Start with the Roof, Work 1972 to 2008, and Slideshow, the first major exhibition to explore the history of projected slides in post-1965 art. With Johns Hopkins University professor Michael Fried, she moderated a series of conversations with major figures in contemporary photography, including Jeff Wall and Tasta Deem. Darsie began her career in the photography department at the Museum of Modern Art, New York. She was a visiting critic at the University of Pennsylvania for 4 years, ending when she relocated here with her family in 2008. Darsie received her BA from Bates College and an MA from Williams College. And without further ado, Darsie Alexander.
Thank you very much. And I really do hope that this is the beginning of some conversations and curatorial dialogues. We have a lot of conversations within the Walker about art, but we don't always have an opportunity to just pick a topic of interest randomly and make a talk out of it. One of the things that actually sitting down, as the many students in the audience will know, and having to think seriously about a subject is a process of really distilling a position and forming opinion. And in a way, I use this moment to stop and think. And so what I'm going to deliver to you are pieces of thought, some more complete than others. And I hope at the end that you'll ask me whatever questions pop to mind and give some general opinions to me and to your colleagues of the subject at hand. So with that, I want to thank all of you for coming tonight, especially on such a beautiful night. When I walked out of my office this afternoon at 5, I thought, oh great, it's been raining since last August, and the first day of sun is an hour and a half before my talk. This is not good. As we know in Minnesota, everything hinges on the weather. But in all seriousness, I feel very fortunate and have ever since arriving at the Walker now over 2 years ago to have such an engaged and interested community of students, artists, and collectors who regularly do join us for conversations about contemporary art, either through exhibition dialogues, the open field, which is about to begin in June, or post-screening discussions. In a recent gathering right here in this room, organized by the Knight Foundation, the subject of the soul of a community was raised. And art was really listed as a key factor of this community's social fabric, not only as art can ignite a meaningful modes of reflection, but as it plays a really active role in our lifestyles, our sense of place, and our need to express ourselves. Increasingly, how art remains relevant and purposeful to people, people who have never had more demands on their time and attention, has sparked provocative conversations, and now more than ever, institutions are looking at ways to animate the meaning of art beyond what is experienced by observing or even handling it in the first person. We have countless ways now to share our opinions about art, to say what we like about it and don't, and gather information that's not only archival, but that's also spontaneous and subjective, coming from disparate points of view and fueled by various histories. A part of what I want to do tonight is to address a little bit of this last point, the relationship of contemporary art to history and to memory. As many of you know, I'm going to just bring this first slide up. Institutions that collect, such as the Walker, help to define what that history becomes and what they choose to borrow, display, and acquire. And that history then forms part of a larger narrative that we call art history. I also want to think about contemporary art here as it might be seen, say, 20 to 30 years from now. Now, of course, this is a pretty ludicrous proposition. I can barely guess what we might see next year, let alone in 2 decades. It's been said that in the art world, the names of artists and galleries and the people that you're likely to come across on magazine covers or in exhibitions turn over about once every 4 years, along with the election and college cycles. I don't know if that's true, but it does feel that we live in this very accelerated climate of newness in contemporary art. In the timetables of art, that's 2 Venice Biennales, 1 Documenta, more or less, 4 Miami and Basel art fairs, and 40 issues of Artforum, if I'm likely to stick to the prevalent tastemakers. These numbers can be entertaining for those of us who don't feel the pressure to track them, and a sober reminder for those of us who do. Flipping through any back issue of a contemporary art magazine is a true test of knowledge, endurance, and, of course, memory. Pretty good at the 4-year interval, a little trickier at 8, going further back in time. And beyond a decade, we are deep into the archive, pulling up distant names and exhibitions. And this one, I graduated in 1987, so I had to take the 1987 cover of Art in America. And of course, I can't remember anything about many of the things that were covered in that issue. This observation is not made with any editorial position on some of the works that I've just shown, but rather to underscore the mushrooming of a field and a business that continues to produce and reproduce itself in art galleries and museums, on blogs and in magazines, and at fairs and international art events across the globe. All of these outlets collectively give us a tremendous opportunity to see for ourselves what's happening in art now, but not a lot of time to digest it before moving on to the next outpost or destination. As members of the Rocks Media Collective have astutely put it, in a struggle to keep pace with the clocks, we are now and everywhere in a state of jet lag, always catching up with ourselves, slightly short of breath, slightly short of time. I would say that this is a general truism of many of us, not just a phenomenon of the contemporary art world, which is a bit of our subject here. It doesn't take a lengthy exercise of perusing old back issues of magazines to just see how short time is and how young contemporary art can be. Of course, that depends on who you're asking. Contemporary can mean a lot of things. At Tate Modern, it's anything made after 1965. For the Museum of Contemporary Art Los Angeles, the date goes back a little earlier, starting in 1940. And most institutions modeled on the European Kunsthalle's version of contemporary art center their activities more or less starting around 1990, coinciding with the internet boom. In general, collecting institutions tend to take a longer view of the limits of contemporary art, in part because the act of collecting is one of preserving and even historicizing, even as seminal older works remain as dynamic and relevant today as when they were made. At the Walker, we tend towards a mid-60s view of things and a little later, though our collection does go back much earlier. Within that chronology, we're heightened to the work of the past 5 to 10 years. That is the work of our own time. As a reminder, the word contemporary comes from a Latin root, contemporaneous, con being with or in, and temporaneous time, that is, existing, occurring, or living at the same time as something or someone else. This equates with an observance of and relationship to the things that are happening in this shared experience of our time, including artworks and people we can name, but also trends that we can feel, that we might call a pulse or a sensibility of a time. Figuring out what's happening in one's own time in the midst of it is part of the fun and challenge of being a curator. Now, through the first decade of the 21st century, we're already in a mode of assessment and debate about where we're headed. In this cinema, a couple of weeks ago, the critic and theorist Dieter Rollstrate issued a few ideas concerning perceptible patterns within artistic practice of recent years, including a renewed emphasis on research, the return to craft, and I couldn't help but put something from the spectacular vernacular in the sequence of images, in part because that's somewhat of a sub-theme of the exhibition, and thirdly, a desire to collaborate. On a more philosophical level, there have been broader proposals on the character of our time. Boris Groys has argued, for instance, that a degree of doubt, hesitation, and uncertainty characterize our relationship to the contemporary, rather than a fixation on progress, which we associate more with the modern era. And indeed, art never has offered more of an opportunity for disparate opinion to be shared and vetted, and indeed given an audience, than the artworks we're seeing today. More installations, artist projects, and online outlets are geared towards stimulating open-ended conversations and encounters, often through highly personalized interactions between artists and participants who are encouraged to bring their own worldview, personality, and background to the discussion. It's long been understood that people experience art very differently, but now more than ever, that difference is constituting a core value of the artwork itself. Indeed, it is increasingly promoted by the questions that art asks, sometimes quite explicitly. Questions like, what do you consider to be progress? This was the question posed to me by a 10-year-old girl at the entry point of Tino Sehgal's installation at the Guggenheim last year, entitled appropriately, This Progress. Berlin-based Sehgal, who started his career as a dancer and choreographer, had taken over the dramatic Frank Lloyd Wright building on Fifth Avenue to stage a walking conversation between his trained interpreters and drop-in visitors, some who came to participate and others who no doubt fell upon the installation probably on their way to the Kandinskys or something. The premise was simple enough. Stripped of its bare walls and stripped of its wall art and pedestal art, the Guggenheim became a void to be filled by sounds and the movements of people. In the absence of things, they became the center point and focus of the artistic activity. One by one, visitors were led up the ramp, engaged in conversation for a few minutes, and then passed off to the next interpreter, who would redirect the topic or drop it altogether. Under these circumstances, the curator hat that I normally wear on such occasions instantly blew off, and it was replaced by concerned mother, nervous pupil, and sometimes reluctant participant. Over the next hour, I strolled and conversed with other trained interpreters of all ages. As with life, some conversations were more rewarding than others, with interpreters variously drawing out my answers, redirecting conversation, or simply unloading their own worries. Progress, it seemed, was just an opener for Sehgal to get to another matter, our capacity for meaningful yet fleeting human relationships. The 20th century was so sure of itself, he says, and I hope that the 21st century will be less sure. Part of that is to listen to what other people say. If doubt and hesitation are to be characteristics of this generation, as Groys proposed, their qualities leveraged to their fullest potential in these kinds of artworks, ones that have no right or wrong approach, but instead offer a platform for open-ended dialogue, personal reflection, and intellectual discourse. I raise the matter of Sehgal's piece not only because it seems to capture a prevailing interest in interpersonal dialogue within contemporary art, but because such a work immediately calls into question if and how it is to be collected. On the one hand, the work is made explicitly within and for the institution, drawing upon the monumental architecture and gravitas of its museum setting. On the other, it flies in the face of what most institutions consider to be benchmarks of collecting, including the clear possession of a physical artifact and, barring that, some form of documentation that proves legitimate ownership. Nasegal adamantly rejects any and all forms of documents noting and recording his work. So all of the photos that I've been showing you were actually sort of taken surreptitiously. These strategies and these prohibitions render the jobs of registrars, archivists, and occasionally curators quite challenging. A few years ago, the Walker purchased a piece called This Objective of That Object, a gallery-scaled work animated again by the actions of a group of trained interpreters who surround visitors and respond to their cues according to a loosely prescribed set of actions and vocalizations. And we do have some images, but I wanted to abide by the artist's wishes in this case, since we do own this piece, by not showing you any of them. The work, like others by the artist, is deeply psychological, challenging the comfort zone of normalized behavior, especially in museums, through provocative words and gestures. To acquire it, we had to forgo some of our own systems and play by the artist's rules. And I would say that we really do try to do this. It's one of the great things about the Walker is that we suspend our own protocols sometimes when we need to really follow the lead of artists. And that enables us to constantly be challenging our own systems and forms of record keeping. The purchase agreement was made as an in-person contract conferred by a handshake. No pictures were secured, no notes were taken. It was a contract issued on trust. If over time people forget or disagree over the details and enact the piece according to a slightly misbegotten memory, such is the course of art's natural aging. According to the artist, every installation will be a new present, wholly dependent on the individual who's sustain and reimagine it. The living on of his performance work presumes that, in effect, people will continue to talk about it, debate its meaning, and remember differently its permutations. A recent performance work staged by the Walker but occurring elsewhere in the Twin Cities also relied on a kind of personal contract, not to formalize its place within an institution, but to actually catalyze its execution real time. The project, organized by the British collective Blast Theory, originated between two grain silos in southeast Minneapolis. And to do it, participants had to agree to its terms, plugging their responses into a cell phone pad. So you had to agree, yes, I will, that Blast Collective is Blast Theory is absolved of any responsibility pertaining to my actions over the next 30 minutes. I mean, it's interactive insofar as they're registering opinion as you punch it into your phone. People would sign up, assume their specified positions at an assigned location, and wait for the phone call. When the call came, an automated voice at the other end directed people's next steps, pacing them through the landscape according to a prescribed soundtrack of stops and turns. From the beginning, the effort was posited as a kind of screen test, and we were actors preparing for a fictional bank heist. Through various twists and turns, we end up slightly across town in a nondescript pharmacy and a narrative cliffhanger, one that required us, the participants, to make the final decision. While playing this role could be engrossing in itself, for me, one of the intrigues resided in the artist's construct. We were actors in someone else's story, with various imaginary cameras zooming in and out of our activity as if we were on a reality TV show. So you're listening on the phone to a description of what your next steps are, but you're also being reminded that there are cameras everywhere around you. And you're put in the position both of trying to take action according to what is being prescribed, but you're given an imaginary challenge, which is conceive of this as if you were auditioning for a part. While playing, was the idea of this setup that the real experience in and of itself would not satisfy our sense of adventure, but the in-your-head cinematic version would. Was an image needed to spark the imagination and in turn seal the memory of an already unforgettable drama? Can such an ephemeral art think this way about its future? That is, its future in someone else's consciousness. Historically, artists, especially ones who have centered their practices on site or even event-based works, have had to deal with this problem of how to sustain their work after the fact. And photography and video have for some been part of the solution. Photographic images have long anchored our memories, illustrating our childhoods or serving as evidence that something happened somewhere in a time worth remembering. Yet some artists have had an awkward relationship to images designed to immortalize their events for the future. Back in the 60s and 70s, artists like Vito Acconci, Robert Morris, or Ana Mendieta were making temporal, site-specific conceptual artworks or performances. They placed a high premium then on the real-time nature of their work, even if intended for a relatively small or even non-existent audience. For some, documenting these raw and spontaneous events ran counter to their intent as something that could not be imitated or visually transcribed. In his essay, The Present Tense of Space, Robert Morris said, "There's probably no defense against the malevolent powers of photography to convert every single aspect of the visible world into a static, consumable image." Now, the Segal example aside for the moment, I don't need to tell anyone in the audience how very drastically this attitude has changed. Bless you. The image itself is now a key driver affecting how performances are imagined and staged. This was nowhere more clear than during a recent performance at the Museum of Modern Art in New York by a work by Marina Abramovic called "The Artist is Present." There at the centerpiece of this ambitious monographic survey was the artist herself, an early pioneer of performance art, sitting perfectly still as visitors were invited to station themselves across from her for up to 30 minutes. With all eyes affixed from the margins of this cordoned-off space, it was an extraordinary event for those who participated and pure spectacle for those who watched. And I just have to, when I was looking for images online, of course, which is how we put together our slide talks these days very quickly, there was a website called Marina Made Me Cry. And there were all these images of people who had such an emotive response to sitting across from this artist that they were brought to tears. And I find that whole thing completely fascinating, that both the kind of intensity that she was able to elicit just from sitting quietly with someone, an intensity of emotion, and I guess the feeling that such emotions are now public, and as this site rendered so clearly. The brilliant lamps flooding the space of the artist and her partner participant were enough to make anyone feel included in the soundstage of her success, which was also, of course, the museum's success, since attendance numbers were just off the charts for this show. And I'm going to show you a couple more pictures of people that were at this event. It's notable for an artist whose career has been as long as that as Marina's and has always involved some form of interaction with audiences, how very dramatically different her relationship with the public has changed over time. A 1974 piece, which invited participants to use various pleasure and pain-yielding objects on the artist's body, elicited her observation that if you leave it up to the audience, they'll kill you. What do some of today's performance-based works say about our time? Certainly, we're seeing some of the effects of participation culture on how works are being imagined and staged. And we're also, I think, seeing some response to the frenetic pace of life and it is in a desire to reinstate a really protracted viewing experience, one that requires a commitment of time and a willingness to suspend the barrage of daily activity and busy work to engage with the artist's durational process. This came across in a work we recently featured at the Walker by Japanese movement artist Eiko Nkoma. Over the course of a month in November, they lived in our gallery space for up to 8 hours a day, taking an occasional bathroom break, animating a nest-like environment with incrementally slow movements and gestures. For many, a primal life-death state was evoked by their month-long journey, in which the smallest movements seemed to mark a monumental passage of time. It was a daring and at the same time really reassuring work about two people who have been together for decades and whose collaborations witness the subtleties of human change, both physical and psychological. In a brochure that attended the exhibition, the artists issued their invitation: linger, stay here with your eyes. Live and kinetically observe how our bodies move towards the unknown, end quote. No expectations, no pressure, just time. Time-based art and art-based time. Many of the examples that I've given you so far are of this idea of time-based, which does encompass a lot of different practices and genres that have an element of live performance, action, or site specificity. This is an area of particular interest to the Walker and one that we actively address in our collecting. And I put this slide up because many of you may be aware that we recently acquired the holdings of the Mercer Cunningham dance archive, including a lot of props and backdrops and set decor for works by people like Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg, and younger people like Ernesto Neto, who collaborated with Cunningham throughout his career and made these extraordinary objects that neither really fit traditionally within the history of art, nor are they often written into the context of dance narratives. And I think that with an acquisition such as this one, we really have an opportunity to bring the histories of dance and visual arts together simply through their material residue in this case. We can tell certain stories as they are passed along through these objects. But as you can see from some of these examples I have provided of these different artists, they have vastly different perspectives on the fascinating challenge of how their work is collected and preserved, that in some ways is dependent on their very ephemeral nature and whether or not those ephemeral events actually produced cast-off, physical things that could be acquired. How one gets and understands that live experience, which is, again, something that is so much a part of the fabric of this institution, later in time and certainly later in life, is an open question that each answers differently with their own set of do's and don'ts. It was recently said, for example, that the relics of performance art involve documentation that make it quite clear that the art itself is no longer available. I think this is less and less true as our capacity to record on multiple platforms, capture detailed instructions and descriptions from participants, and preserve artifacts of pivotal moments expands. We're no longer burdened, as we once were, with a sense that we may be missing something somewhere, or that key details are unavailable to us. The internet allows us to travel almost anywhere for art, even if our physical location stays more or less the same. Our opportunity to experience, then, is comprised of an expanded field of options, ones that do not, I believe, compete with the primacy of the in-person encounter, but in fact can encourage it. Now, this is where I take a little break from my scripted text to say that I got back from China recently, about 6 months ago, and I've kind of been looking for an excuse to talk about my trip to China. And this talk is a little bit that. I wanted to, kind of in the first half, and we're now at the halfway point, at least, address the issue of how an institution such as the Walker, but many other institutions, are increasingly interested in performance and live events, and these live events can unfold in a whole lot of different ways, and I gave just a few examples. These events are often what we call time-based events. But what I want to do now is talk a little bit about time in a more specific way, and I think the reason that I'm weaving together this side note on China is that time there seems to be happening at an extraordinary accelerated rate. And I actually spent part of my senior year of college in China and hadn't been back since. And I wanted to talk in a way about the way that artists in China are marking the passage of time, and also in some ways considering the losses that time has wrought. So I wanted to, as I said, switch gears here just for a minute and talk about this installation that I saw while I was in China in November that was part of the Shanghai Biennale. And the theme of the Biennale was the rehearsal, which was a really interesting construct. In a way, it seemed kind of funny to be in this extraordinarily, in a way, advanced unique form of capitalism that's emerging there, and to be in an exhibition called The Rehearsal, because clearly they were sort of on center stage, if you want to use that metaphor. But the organizers of the show were trying to deal with concepts of before, during, and after. And I saw a number of artists when I was there kind of grappling with some of these same themes. And I would say that they were particularly legible in a 7-screen work by Beijing artist Yang Fudong, who has variously explored the tensions between traditional Chinese and newly westernized lifestyles in his work in video and photography. The piece that I'm about to show you is called The Fifth Night, and it's a strange conglomeration of frames, both visual and time-based, and concentrates on the movement of two more or less protagonists who wander through a brightly lit sound stage in a fictitious Shanghai of the 1930s. Through various angles and images, we bear witness to both the film and the film being made, the latter treated not as a secondary bit of supporting evidence, but as a significant element in the work's finished presence. So let's quickly have a look at this clip. Or slowly, maybe a better way of looking at it. Okay, and she eventually steps out of the scene. And to just describe what this installation is like in person, you're actually standing in a darkened room, and there are 7 projections going simultaneously. Sometimes one scene is being shown as it might appear in a movie, and other times the same scene is shown as it's being filmed. So you stand in the middle of this space with these very, very carefully orchestrated movements of these many characters circling around you, and you're more or less looking at the same sound stage, just from these multiple perspectives. So as quiet as that still is, it actually is kind of quite a dizzying experience to be in the space of this installation. What I think is so striking about this piece is not only that the artist has enabled these multiple perspectives to take place at once as a rehearsal and a final take, but how explicitly he draws upon other moments in time to infuse the work with a strong sense of melancholy and loss. We're on the one hand seeing a past event being acted out now, the moment of the film was made, as well as the more historical moment that it makes reference to, that is the 1930s. But also the tension of the contemporary as it's introduced within each frame. The new-looking garments, the earrings of the woman, the state-of-the-art technology, which you see in a photograph such as this one. As you can tell from the excerpt, the film moves really, really slowly and rhythmically, as if waiting for its own crescendo, which of course never comes. Characters emerge and disappear from view, seemingly in search of one another. Fifth Night also seems to embrace its own nostalgia and yearning, making something of the past that does seem very much of this moment. For a Western visitor who hadn't been to China since the late 80s, it is tempting to read into the themes of Yang Fudong's Fifth Night in response to the dramatic visual shifts that have happened in that country over the past decades, and the loss of histories, cultural, social, architectural, that have attended this explosive growth. In places like Beijing and to a lesser extent Shanghai, very little of the past is overtly visible in what you see as a tourist, except maybe in tourist destinations such as the Forbidden City. In the rush of this forward motion, remembering the past becomes more difficult as fewer touchstones are available to trigger its resurrection. Of course, artists have a wide range of reactions to whether or not to sort of mythologize China's past and in a way preserve it, or fast track into the blossoming, one could say, exploded art market capital that is happening there right now. A lot of artists, though, have sought to preserve those things that seem to be on the brink of disappearing and capturing elements of the past in their contemporary work, either in the form of artifacts to be remixed and reused, or to more explicitly preserve an endangered site or history. And I'm looking here at a photograph by Che Sung Liang, who worked in China and started working there in the early 2000s. He's a Mexican-born, New York-based photographer, and he's been really systematically documenting the widespread transformation of China's urban centers, focusing his material on the gradual elimination and subsequent reconstruction of the historic built environment, including traditional neighborhoods from its imperial and communist past. So soon-to-be neighborhoods butt up against these gargantuan structures of urban apartment blocks and business centers, forming a visual schism of surprisingly demarcated lines, as bulldozers eliminate with striking efficiency the meandering networks of streets and residences that formed China's cities. Rather than sentimentalize these losses, however, the artist describes them with scrupulous clarity in his pictures, acknowledging that they are part of a long history of destruction and rebuilding, as one dynasty gave way to another, imperialism to communism, communism to a market-driven economy, etc. A principal tool for shaping reality in China is erasure, he writes. The centrality that erasure occupies in China is encapsulated in Tiananmen Square, a spatial expression of state power carved as a blank slate out of the former imperial city. How the square was created, its symbolic significance, and its history suggests that the greatest and most valued power of the state is the authority to erase. I bring this slide up because on April 3rd, the Chinese artist Ai Weiwei was detained for economic crimes at a Beijing airport as he tried to board a plane for Hong Kong. Weiwei is an internationally recognized artist, arguably China's most famous, whose notoriety expanded beyond the art world with his involvement in the design of the so-called bird's nest at the Beijing Olympics and other recent projects such as a huge installation of handcrafted sunflower seeds that covered the floor of the Tate's Turbine Hall. No stranger to the authorities in China and someone who's been detained before, this prolonged and unaccounted for recent silence is by far the most alarming of his arrests. In addition, several members of his immediate circle are also disappearing for a time, including his lawyer and a studio designer. This news came with particular resonance for those of us who were invited to meet the artist at his newly constructed studio outside of Beijing this past November. The events that unfolded shortly after we left were strikingly reminiscent of the photographs taken by Che Songliang of China. Its studio was destroyed by the government with no clear reasoning as to why. And I guess part of the reason why I think it's important to acknowledge these types of things within talks that have to do with broader issues is that when you're an institution that prides itself on a global program, as we do, we have to acknowledge that being an artist in the United States or in Europe is a very different experience than being an artist in other parts of the world. And we've seen many stories attached to some of the filmmakers and the performing artists that we've showed in our program. It feels a little strange to talk about Weiwei's work in this sort of mode of mourning because we don't know what his status is, but mostly and especially because that's not at all how his work resonates in person. It's got this extraordinary visual scale. It's complex. It's got sensual appeal. And I just wanted to show you a couple examples of his work. This is a huge installation that he did at Documenta in 2000 called Fairy Tale, and it was designed to seat 1,001 ordinary people from all over China who were invited to Germany to experience the work and the show free of any costs. And then this amazing piece, which is a chandelier in the shape of a boomerang. It actually evokes the kinds of chandeliers that you might see in a Chinese banquet or restaurant. And then this is the bed of seeds that was at Tate. In an interview held on the occasion of his opening at Tate, Weiwei was asked a two-part question by a visitor, one that feels uniquely relevant to this conversation about the future of site-based art. What will happen to the seeds after the show, and are people allowed to take them? He responded by saying, "Perhaps your second question is the answer to the first." It appeared, at least, that he hadn't given much thought to what would happen to his art, even though, subsequent to the interview, the installation had to be closed to pedestrians since the dust kicked up from the porcelain seemed to be affecting the HVAC system adversely. This was not the first time, however, that he had had some misadventures with his work. At Documenta, his enormous outdoor sculpture template fell down after a heavy storm. Some, including myself, who saw it in this collapsed state, found it equally mesmerizing, perhaps because it had fallen so dramatically like a house of cards. How do we preserve and carry into some unknown time these fragile works when their survival is sometimes challenged in the present moment? And how do we know which version of contemporary art to select today? If the expansion of the world, including the art world, has taught us anything, it's that there is no single contemporary art, but there is much art that constitutes this contemporary moment, some of which I've talked about tonight. Even those who seek quality or excellence, or whatever term you want to use, we must accept a degree of uncertainty. If anything is known for sure, it is that consensus will change, and there will be opportunities to go back and look at fresh eyes on what was previously overlooked. And I just wanted to show this slide of the installation Benches and Binoculars because part of the fun of it was to really look way back into the Walkers' history and imagine what was conceived of as contemporary art, say, in the 40s or 1940 and later. And the painting that you see in the middle is the Franz Marc painting, which was purchased as the first contemporary work in 1940, but it was actually made in 1911. So the ideas around what constituted contemporary were very different than they are now, and they continue to remain in flux. As curators, we look at new work as much as possible. We do regular studio visits and keep up on the larger venues of art, including the many art fairs and biennials. And our work requires us, too, to not get overly caught up in the latest developments of the art world. We try to envision multiple paths as they can take place at the same time. Art history can function in a lot of different directions, as Yves Klein once proposed. Speaking about the work of the early 20th century suprematist painter Kazimir Malevich, Yves Klein, who rose to prominence decades later, said, "I can say at the age of 30 in 1958 that when Malevich burst onto the scene around 1915 or 1916, he did so as a tourist, and I was there to welcome him, and he visited me, for I was a proprietor already and always." What's so striking about this quote is not only its brilliant audacity, which is to say that he's saying that he influenced Malevich, but also his refusal to see artistic relationships in a nice, congruent, and orderly sequential package. And I should say that by way of packages, what you're looking at on the bottom slide is an installation of the Klein Show here at MoMA. And we did not actually use the painting by Malevich on the top to help set the template of the floor plan because they look remarkably similar to one another, but that was totally serendipitous. He proposes that art can belong to multiple time frames and that contemporary art in particular can haunt the past as much as beckon the future. Insofar as we at museums and art centers are stewards of those different times, we must acknowledge and even protect those things that do not syncopate perfectly with prevailing trends, but that are first maybe extremely difficult to place or make sense of as objects. It may happen that such works will eventually tell a story of something deeply significant, but still imperceptible to us now. Thank you. I thought, in the interest of time, I'd show this, which is a still from this wonderful piece, which unfortunately I couldn't show you, or I couldn't show you legally, which is by the artist Christian Markley, who we've shown here at the Walker. And it's a 24-hour film comprised of snippets of movies that basically tell time. So if you go to the film at 9:15 in the morning, all of the clips are of various characters encountering a clock at roughly 9:15. So you're experiencing this amazing array of films kind of oddly in real time. The time of the installation aligns with the actual time of day. Yet within that construct, you see actors age because they come back again at different times in their career through different clips. And it's just, it's perhaps a more literal reading of this subject, but just a fantastic work. So I'll leave that up and ask if any of you have any questions. I can't really see.
Yeah, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the challenges of the materials that are chosen by artists, the impermanence of them, and what challenges they present, and also whether that is a challenge, whether that also affects the acquiring of that art.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, materials are, we have a term that we use in the art business called inherent vice, and it's when, objects contain something about their making that is sort of doesn't work in the interest of preservation. And honestly, it really depends on the artist. Some artists see the change of their work over time as part of the value of the work, that works change, human beings change, art ages. And there are other cases where, we know to make a really concerted effort to keep things as sort of perfectly as they were meant to be in their original state. So, there's no formula. That's the thing. People are working in so many different materials now. And because many of the artists we collect, fortunately, are alive, when we're purchasing their work, we try to get as much information on how they want us to take care of their works as we can. So, yeah, anybody else?
I just happened to be sort of surfing around last night, and I was reading Karl Marx.
Where are you? Wait.
Right front.
Oh.
Hi. I was reading Karl Marx and his theories, and he was talking about how communism.
Good for you.
Communism
It's been a while.
yeah. And it was kind of, because I'd never really read it myself, how it would succeed capitalism. And, of course, his version didn't really happen that way. And I look at art and the incredible fist of capitalism, how it's arisen in the last half century or so, and really made its mark on how art was defined. And now you've been talking in contemporary art about art primarily as an experience and objects that do not really need in any way to be owned by anybody. And on the other hand, we have street art, which is in its greatest flowering is, again, not something that's owned by anybody. I just don't see capitalism going away. It's such a dominating, force in our society. How's the money gonna come back at this?
The money. Okay, so is this a communism question, a money question?
No, I mean it's like I just don't see it disappearing.
Yeah,
if there is no object to own, it's going to make it difficult for the powers that be in the art world to generate like Alice Marquis wrote about the art industrial complex. Where's the art industrial complex in all this?
Well, I haven't read that book, but
It's great. She's fabulous. Alice, go far.
I got to talk to you afterwards. You can give me a reading list. But I think that in terms of the art market now, I mean it kind of did take a little bit of a dip after the September of 2008, but it's still really going strong. And there's a huge base of very active collectors who have the resources to buy, occasionally even outpace some museums in making acquisitions. But some of the work that I showed you is of artists who are deliberately working against that model, that are trying to subvert the collectability of their art. So for an institution like the Walker, we kind of collect them in a different way. We collect them through history, through texts, through documents, through interviews, through contracts, things that help us locate a relationship to the artist as much as to the artwork. So, anybody else? Yeah.
So going back to the money again, I subscribed to Art Forum a number of years ago, and kind of the overall impression I got is that the art world was dominated by relationships between art institutions and billionaires who go to the biennials. And not that that's a negative thing, but it seems that it's a strong influence on it. Could you speak a little bit to that relationship, and also how it almost seemed that for the billionaires it was entertainment and also a way to compete with each other?
Mm-hmm. Well, art has a lot of different functions for a lot of different people. I mean, art has always been a status, symbol back to the de Medicis, But, I know there are a lot. How many artists are there in the audience? A fair number of artists. And, that model that, billionaire art monger model is actually a very small segment of the population of people who are really collecting art and making art on a daily basis. And I think, because that model has a certain amount of glamour attached to it and resources attached to it, it gets a lot of play in the media. But, there are so many artists and collectors who are working outside of that model that, I would just say something trite like, don't believe everything you read, or, but I really think that there are many different art markets and many different kinds of collectors, and fortunately, institutions like the Walker attract a whole range of different people who share different kinds of passions and enthusiasms for art, including art by people that don't really have their market yet. So I try to be more optimistic. Okay, maybe one more question?
Money's just way too fun. So I have one last question. It is money related. I'm interested in how institutions are starting to portray more time-based events, and what your thoughts are on how that has to do with the economic shift in the art world, with the lack of art funding and kind of institutions reaching back to the audience in a different way, in a more collaborative way.
I'm not sure that they're totally syncopated. In other words, I don't know if there's a cause and effect between the lack of, or the maybe diminished public funds for art and the whole phenomenon of mediation and social engagement. I think that's coming out of a desire to connect with art very differently, a desire that I think has been catalyzed by some of these platforms, including the internet, that have given people a way to express themselves as never before, to share their opinions. We know more about what each other is thinking. People are now more comfortable sharing their views of art, asking questions, and artists, I think, are keyed into that and also contributing to it. I mean, in part by making work that that elicits a sense of a human encounter of some kind. Now, that said, I will say that there are a lot of artists that don't work that way, that that really are fine making pieces that hang on a gallery wall and are fairly static and are contemplative or reflective things. And in those instances, as an institution, where we try to animate is through the kinds of conversations that we can generate around this otherwise quite quiet thing. So I think this has really been a very significant development in the past 10 years. But I don't know if there's a correlation exactly to the to the economy. I think beyond just people wanting to spend more time together, finding more ways of communicating with one another and using art to do that. So I think that's it. Thank you. I'm going to stick around if any of you want to talk afterwards, but I really appreciate your coming out on such a beautiful night.